You know what nobody prepared 90s kids for? Growing up. Not because growing up is hard for everyone. It is. But because 90s kids were raised in a world that literally doesn't exist anymore, and their brains are still wired for it. If you were born roughly between 1985 and 1999, you didn't just grow up in a different decade. You grew up in a different civilization. And the psychological fingerprint that left on you is something most people have never had explained to them. Until now. Here's what makes 90s kids neurologically unique. You are the last generation whose brains were wired in an analog world, but forced to operate in a digital one. Neuroscientists call this a critical period mismatch. Your brain's foundational wiring, the architecture that forms between ages 3 and 12, was built on slow information. Encyclopedias you had to physically open, libraries you had to physically visit, arguments that couldn't be settled by pulling out a phone because phones were attached to walls. A study in cognitive development found that children who processed information through physical media developed stronger long-term memory encoding. Not because books are magic, but because effort creates depth. When it took you 45 minutes at the library to find one answer, that answer stuck. Your brain filed it as important because it cost you something. 90s kids didn't just learn information, they earned it. And that completely changes how your brain values knowledge. But here's where 90s kids have an advantage nobody talks about. You were bored. Constantly. Profoundly. Beautifully bored. No tablets in the car, no YouTube at the restaurant, no infinite scroll on the couch. You had a window and your own thoughts. Maybe a Game Boy if you were lucky. And that died after 2 hours because batteries weren't rechargeable. What psychologists now understand is that boredom is not empty time. It's incubation time. When your brain has zero external input, it activates the default mode network. That's the part of your brain responsible for creativity, self-reflection, empathy, and imagining the future. Researchers at the University of Oregon found that unstructured childhood downtime is one of the strongest predictors of adult creativity. 90s kids had hours of it, every single day. No one was optimizing their free time. No one was scheduling their play. You just existed. And your brain used that silence to build something extraordinary. That's why 90s kids tend to be the ones who can sit alone with their thoughts and not panic. While everyone else reaches for their phone in an elevator, you're completely fine just standing there. Your brain was trained for empty space. It knows what to do with it. Now here's something about 90s kids that sounds contradictory but is actually deeply psychological. You're not actually nostalgic for the 90s. You're nostalgic for a specific psychological state that the 90s accidentally created. Think about it. What you actually miss isn't dial-up internet or Blockbuster. You miss the feeling of not being reachable. You miss the feeling of a Friday night where the plan was, just show up. You miss being bored with your friends and somehow that being enough. What you're nostalgic for is the absence of choice overload. Psychologist Barry Schwartz calls this the paradox of choice. The more options you have, the less satisfied you feel with any of them. 90s kids grew up with 3 TV channels, 2 options for Friday night, and 1 phone in the hallway. And they were happier, not because the options were better, but because the absence of infinite choice let them actually be present. That's the 90s kid paradox. You now have access to everything, and you trade it all for the feeling of having just enough. But there's something about 90s kids that almost never gets talked about. And this is the part that might hit harder than you expect. You were the test generation, the experiment, the bridge between 2 completely different worlds. And nobody gave you a manual for the crossing. You learned to type on a computer in school, but you learned to be human without one. You got your first cell phone at 16, not 6. You experienced a childhood where your mistakes weren't recorded, where your embarrassing moments actually faded with time, where reinventing yourself was as simple as switching schools or starting a new summer. And then, almost overnight, the rules changed. Privacy became a setting, not a default. Attention became a currency. Your worth started being measured in followers and likes. And you're old enough to remember when none of that existed. Here's what psychologists are starting to identify. 90s kids experience a specific form of grief that doesn't have a clinical name yet. It's not grief for a person. It's grief for a world. A world where not everything was content, where dinner wasn't photographed, where connection meant physical presence and nothing else. You grieve a version of reality that your own children will never understand. And the strange part is, you can't fully explain it to anyone who didn't live it. You just know that something fundamental shifted, and you felt every second of the transition because you were standing right on the fault line. But here's what all of this actually means. 90s kids aren't just nostalgic people, they're translators. They're the only generation alive that is fully fluent in both worlds. You know what it feels like to be unreachable, and you know what it feels like to be always on. You understand the value of boredom, and you understand the pull of the infinite scroll. You've lived both, and that gives you something no other generation has. Perspective. You can teach the older generation how to adapt. You can teach the younger generation what they're missing. Not because you're better, but because you're the only ones who experienced the before and the after. Your analog childhood gave you depth. Your digital adulthood gave you reach. And the combination of both made you something rare. Not a lost generation. Not a forgotten generation. A bridge. And bridges don't get celebrated. They just quietly hold everything together. Which honestly is the most 90s kid thing there is. But there's one specific habit 90s kids developed that's quietly affecting every relationship they have as adults. And most of them have no idea they're doing it. That's what this video explains.